Alright, so what if you want your game to be bigger than 640 by 480? Because you can't see the images and it's stupid to have it that small anymore. Um, well, we have to make just a few different adjustments. So instead of, we're going to be working in the main class for the first little while, this Brickbreaker 1920 to whatever you have it called. So we have to take this stuff out. So let's just delete it all. And we're gonna do those same things in different ways. So those variables were used to kind of define the width and height of things and the blah 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 number of rows, etc. So we're gonna just do this with variables that we can change rather than final variables. So we're gonna have one called grid width and grid height. Now these are the sort of the if you imagine like a grid being overlaid onto the top half of the game window, it's like the upper, like the bricks kind of fit inside that grid, so that's what this grid is. And we're gonna have num calls and num rows. Okay, so now in the setup method, we have to make some adjustments. So this became angry at us because there is no such thing as this cap num rows and num calls. So let's use our num rows and num calls variables, which we haven't given any values to yet, but we'll do that in just a second here. So let's give them values. Num rows, there are 4 rows of bricks, at least that's how I have it. Num calls equals 9. And then we're gonna, this is one of the main changes that we're gonna make. The width of the grid that overlays on top of the top half of the screen now, like each block of that grid is going to be defined by this grid width thing. So we need, for this, it should be the integer component of the width of the overall screen divided by the number of columns plus 2. And the plus 2 is just to like give a little bit of like a buffer on the left and right. So there will be as many, the grid width will be as wide as the width divided by the number of columns, which is 9, plus 2, which is 11. So at this point, the grid width will be the overall width, 640, divided by 11, so somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 something. But that'll flex based on how big we make the size of the window. So we need to do that for the grid height. Let's do the integer component, the whole number component of the height divided by 2. So divided by 2 because we only want the bricks to exist on the top half of the screen. Divided by the number of rows plus 1. Because we only are worried about the buffer on the top of the screen related to the rows. Okay, so we're getting there, we're getting there. Go down to the generate bricks method, because you see here there's a couple little red lines, so we can head down to the errors. Well, it's frustrated with us because we have now changed the change the name of these variables to be num rows. So we need to adjust it to the new variables that we made, num calls, times the grid size. So this one with the rows is going to be grid width, plus instead of offset, we're just going to use the width of the grid for the offset. And then row times grid height plus grid height. And so now if we run our program, it shouldn't look hardly different at all quite yet, because we haven't actually changed the size of the window. But let's change the size of the window. So let's make it super tall, just for fun. 800, not super tall, but quite a bit taller. See what this looks like. Okay, well, let's stretch things correctly. Move the bricks so they're more spread out, and that way they still go to about the halfway point down. What if we make it 1,000 wide now? So this is pretty big. All right. Well, still, we see the problem. I think you can tell what the problem is. Everything looks good. It's stretching correctly. You know, it's a resizable game now. But, well, that collision was a little weird, wasn't it? It's stretching correctly, but it's still not, the bricks aren't big enough. So let's change that. So go over to the brick class now. And we're going to just change in the constructor that accepts an image. We're going to change this to like 80 and 60. And the width and height of of how big the brick should be drawn, we're going to change that from 30-20 to 80-60. Okay, look at this carefully. You will notice a problem. The problem is obviously that the ball is going really slowly now. It's bogging down. So this is like one of the main things when people talk about optimization of video games and other programs. This is the kind of stuff you encounter that you have to optimize. So like this is obviously a problem. It doesn't have to do this. I mean, you know, the computer is super fast, much faster than this. So what's going on? Well, we must be doing extra work somewhere that we don't have to do. And in fact, we are. So let's think about what might be the work. Well, processing of images, you know, takes work, but really what takes work is the resizing of things, like how big it is. If you need to make it a different size 1,000 times, well, that operation doesn't need to be performed 1,000 times. It just needs to be performed once and then displayed 1,000 times. So in this case, we are, every time we draw a brick, which is something like 1,000 times, or 600, I don't know how many times a second. 1,000 times a second? 1,500 times a second. So 1,500 times a second, it's having to resize this image to this whatever height and width we tell it. So instead of doing that here in the display method, the resizing, let's do that in the setup method for our brick so that it only has to happen one time. So we have these b width and b height variables. Well, let's just use them to resize the image. My image dot resize b width and b height. But our program is still mad at us. Why is this? Well, if you hover over this, the mouse will say, the pop-up, the tooltip will say, the function resize expects parameters like int. Well, if you scroll up and you notice, well, okay, crap, these are floats. So how do we deal with that? Well, the resize thing just wants the whole number component of whatever is in there. So let's just chop off the decimals by saying int in front. Okay, so now the resize thing is happy. And if we run our program now, I'm pretty sure all will be well with the world. Yes, our bricks are bigger, and the ball seems to be traveling approximately as fast as it used to. Perfect. All right, so that's how to resize your game.